Ever catch yourself, like, wondering just how much of your local news actually comes from one place?
Hmm.
You know those articles you sent over about the Sinclair Broadcast Group?
Right, yeah.
Getting ready for this deep dive, gotta say, I was kind of blown away by just how many stations they own.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
it's a wild one for sure. Sinclair's whole strategy,
Yeah.
it's really been about scooping up stations,
Right.
particularly in these sort of like mid-sized markets, right? Places where, you know,
Makes sense.
local news really matters, right? It's like the main thing people depend on.
For sure.
And when you look at their reach, it's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Like broadcasting into something like 40% of U.S. households, it's
40%. That's huge.
it's massive,
I
right?
knew they were a big deal, but wow, that's a lot of influence.
Yeah.
And
It's not like they just,
and they've been very deliberate.
stumbled into this,
Oh,
right?
yeah, very strategic.
You mentioned these sidecar agreements, and honestly, never even heard of that before. Yeah, yeah. So it was kind of their way of,
Okay.
getting around some of those FCC ownership rules, right?
Sneaky.
Well, I mean, clever, I guess, but controversial for sure.
Clever, yeah.
They'd basically find a way to like control a station,
Oh, I
the
see.
content, the way it runs, all that, without technically owning it outright.
So it's like what do you call it, a loophole?
Exactly, a loophole.
Okay, so they could just keep expanding without,
Expand their footprint, exactly.
right, without setting off any alarms, I guess.
Right.
Which reminds me, remember that whole thing with the Tribune Media deal?
Oh yeah, huge.
If that had gone through, man, they would have had a reach of, what was it, like 72%?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It was massive. A lot of people were really concerned.
It's mind-boggling.
Oh, yeah.
That much control over local news.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Media consolidation on that scale.
Yeah.
It's a big deal, right? Could really impact what kind of coverage people are getting at the local level.
That's what worries me, the whole political bias thing.
Right, right.
I mean, come on, we all remember those must-run segments, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where they basically had local anchors reading these
Scripted messages.
yeah, these scripted messages straight from corporate. It was like, I don't know, something you'd expect on cable news, not your local news.
Right, exactly. Like, it was,
It felt so off.
yeah, like out of place, definitely.
Especially that fake news one back in 2018.
Oh, right, yeah.
That felt very, I don't know,
Very pointed.
pointed. Yeah.
Like it had an agenda.
Yeah, exactly. It reminded me of, some of the stuff you'd hear, well,
Yeah, I see what you mean.
from certain politicians. I'll just say that.
Right. There were definitely some parallels, you could say.
Yeah, and, it wasn't just the words. It was the way they were covering, well, certain stories,
The way they framed things.
Yeah. Like you were saying in your research, it seems like there's this pattern, especially with anything about, well,
President Biden.
yeah, President Biden, where it's like they're using these, what's the word, like,
Heavily edited.
yes, heavily edited footage, and just, I don't know, being very selective about what they show to kind of push a certain narrative,
Yeah, it's like they're trying to paint a very specific picture,
Exactly.
and they're not exactly subtle about it.
Not at all. And you know what's really stuck with me? That whole thing with the
The videos.
yeah, the videos that made it look like, well,
Like President Biden had
yeah.
had an accident on stage.
Yeah, and they actually ran with that. Seriously.
They did, yeah. Shared those videos across their whole national network, too.
Wow. Didn't those videos turn out to be,
Oh, yeah, they were totally fake.
fake? And where did they even come from?
Traced them back to the Republican National Committee.
Seriously.
Yeah.
So they're taking a doctored video from, what, a political organization?
Pretty much.
And presenting it as news to millions of people.
Seems like it.
I don't even know what to say to that. It's just wild.
It really highlights this concerning trend.
Yeah.
Where the lines between news and, everything else just gets blurry.
Right.
Especially with local news, where people tend to, trust it more, let their guard down a bit.
It's like you grow up with these local stations, these anchors, they feel familiar.
Like part of the community.
Right, exactly. So you just assume they're giving you the straight story. You're not expecting these, I don't know, these manipulated videos presented as fact.
It's a violation of that
Yeah.
trust, especially with that kind of reach Sinclair has.
Yeah, and if you can't even trust your local news to give you the honest truth, then what? Where do you even turn to?
Right. It's a recipe for confusion, for people to get, swept up in misinformation.
Which reminds me, we should definitely dig into that whole thing with Sinclair and their coverage, or I guess lack of it in some areas.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Because I was looking at some of the numbers you found.
Oh, yeah, it's not pretty.
And it's pretty alarming, honestly. We should definitely talk about that after a quick break. So before we jumped into this whole Sinclair thing, you were saying something about, like,
Oh, yeah, like how their coverage can actually make these local news deserts even worse.
right. Because it's not just about pushing a certain viewpoint, it's about what they're not covering,
Oh,
right?
exactly. It's like they're starving these communities of, you know, actual local news.
And I was looking at this one study you found, I think it was in Montana,
Oh, yeah, that was wild.
where they took over a station and the amount of local news they aired just like plummeted.
Yeah, it was something like,
It was more than half, went from over 400 local stories a week to like 160.
it's crazy.
It's insane. And what gets me is, local news is how we find out what's going on in our own backyards.
Exactly. It's like the school board meeting, the city council vote.
Right. Like if there's some big development project that's going to bulldoze a local park or something.
Or if there's, like, corruption in the local government.
Exactly. Who's going to tell those stories if not the local news?
It's a recipe for, things slipping through the cracks, for people not knowing what's happening in their own communities.
And you know what's scary? With so many local newspapers,
Oh, man, don't even get me started.
folding left and right, it's like those local TV stations, they're often the only ones left.
Seriously, they're like the last line of defense when it comes to keeping people informed.
And if they're not even doing that, if they're just, regurgitating national talking points or whatever.
Yeah, it creates this void.
Right, totally. And we know what happens when there's a void like that, right?
Oh, it gets filled, all right, but not with good stuff.
Right, like all that misinformation and, partisan agendas, it just rushes in to fill the vacuum.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah, totally. Because then people are like, see, the media's all biased anyway, why should I even bother?
And then they just tune out completely.
And the cycle continues.
It's a vicious cycle, for sure.
So, knowing all of this, like, where do we go from here? Are there any solutions to this whole media consolidation mess?
Well, some folks, they talk about bringing back the fairness doctrine. You ever heard of that?
Yeah. That was that rule, right? Where broadcasters had to, like, present both sides of an issue.
This is the gist of it, yeah.
So, like, if they had someone on from, say, one political party.
They'd have to give equal time to the other side.
Right. So, in theory, it sounds like a good idea, right? Promote balanced coverage, prevent any one side from dominating the airwaves.
In theory, sure.
But I feel like there's got to be a catch, right?
Well, for one thing, who gets to decide what's fair and balanced?
That's a good point. Because couldn't that be used to, silence certain voices or push a particular agenda?
Exactly. It could be very easily abused.
I mean, it's not like it's the 1960s anymore, right? Back then, it was just a handful of TV channels.
Now you've got cable news, you've got online platforms, social media. It's like...
It's a whole different world.
Exactly. So even if you could somehow bring back the fairness doctrine, would it even be effective in this day and age?
It's like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube, right?
Pretty much.
So if the fairness doctrine isn't the answer, what about addressing Sinclair directly? Like those sidecar agreements we were talking about before.
Yeah, but you see, that gets tricky too.
How so?
Well, the FCC, they did end up fining Sinclair for that whole Tribune Media thing.
They did. I don't remember that.
Yeah, but it wasn't for breaking any rules, exactly. More like...
Like being sneaky about it.
Exactly. They called it a lack of candor.
Oh, so they were being shady, but not technically breaking the law.
Pretty much.
So it's like, how do you regulate that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Because on the one hand, you don't want to, stifle free speech or have the government dictating what people can and can't say.
Right.
But on the other hand, you can't just let companies like Sinclair run wild and manipulate the news to fit their agenda.
That's a tough one, for sure. And there's no easy answers, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what do we do?
Well, I think it starts with, being more aware of these tactics, these ways that media companies try to influence us.
Like being more media literate.
Exactly.
It's almost like we've been going in circles with this whole trust thing, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Because if you can't even trust your local news, then where do you go from there? It's like the whole foundation starts to crumble.
It's like that sense of shared reality starts to disappear, and that's dangerous.
Right. Because then you've got people turning to, I don't know.
Facebook.
Yeah, or whatever, for their news. And we've seen how that can turn out.
Not great.
Not great at all. But I don't know. It just feels like we're kind of stuck, right? Because the less people trust traditional media,
Right.
the more the quality of local news suffers.
Yeah.
And the cycle just continues.
That's a vicious cycle, for sure.
So what do we do? Like, is there any way to break out of this?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the stuff you sent over,
Hmm.
it talks about this idea of media literacy.
Oh,
Like, how do you even navigate this landscape where it feels like
yeah, it's overwhelming.
it's a lot?
Especially when you think about how sophisticated some of these tactics are, right? Like, we're not just talking about, a few biased headlines here and
It's
there.
much deeper than that.
It's like a whole system designed to, I don't know, shape the way you see the world. And it's hard to even wrap your head around it sometimes.
It's like, you've got algorithms, you've got filter bubbles, you've got all this stuff working behind the scenes to like curate your reality.
Exactly. And it's easy to feel powerless, like what can one person do against all of that?
Well, that's the thing, right? It's easy to get overwhelmed, to feel like you're just along for the ride.
Totally.
But the choices we make, they matter.
Okay, so what kind of choices are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, being more conscious of where you get your news from.
Okay, so like doing your research on different sources.
Exactly. And not just, relying on one news feed or whatever.
Right, so like branching out, getting different perspectives
Exactly. And don't be afraid to, be critical.
of what you're reading, yeah.
Ask questions like you're doing now.
Yeah.
Think about who's behind the information, what their motivations might be.
So it's like being your own fact checker in a way.
Yeah, kind of. And being willing to, call out BS when you see it.
Even if it's from like your uncle on Facebook.
Even then,
Yeah.
because it all adds up. The more we demand better from our media, the more likely we are to actually get it.
That's a good point. It's like we have more power than we think we do, but we have to actually use it.
Exactly.
Wow. This has been, well, I'll be honest, it's been a little overwhelming, but also really eye-opening.
Well, that's the thing about these deep dives, right? Sometimes the truth is a little messy.
It definitely is. But hey, at least we're facing it head on, right? And I think what's really stuck with me is this whole idea of like individual responsibility.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it's easy to feel like, oh, the media landscape is this big, scary thing that I have no control over, but
We do have a say.
we do. And we can choose to be more engaged, more informed, and that gives me, I don't know, a little bit of hope, honestly.
Me too.
So to our listener out there, wherever you're tuning in from,
Hey, thanks for listening.
we hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some tools to navigate this crazy media landscape we're all trying to make sense of.
And remember, be curious, be critical.
And most importantly, stay engaged because the future of news, well, it's kind of up to all of us.
Here's to